Kurt Cobain was still alive in the minds of the people who loved him long after the world decided he was gone. That's the strange thing about endings like this. They don't feel real at first. They don't feel final. They feel like a pause, like someone stepped out of the room and forgot to come back. In early April of 1994, nothing felt resolved. There were loose ends everywhere, conversations that had started but never finished, emotions that hadn't reached their conclusion. Even the people closest to Kurt would later say the same thing. It didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like waiting. To understand that final night, you have to understand the weight that came before it. Kurt Cobain did not wake up one morning and decide to disappear. This wasn't a single bad day or one unbearable moment. It was a slow accumulation of pressure, pain, and contradiction. By the time Nirvana became the voice of a generation, Kurt was already exhausted by the idea of being heard. Fame amplified everything he hated about the world: hypocrisy, commercialization, judgment. The irony was brutal. The more honest he was in his music, the more dishonest the world felt in response. From the outside, Kurt Cobain looked untouchable. He had success, influence, money, and a family. But internally, he lived in constant friction. He despised the idea of rock stardom, yet couldn't escape it. He wanted to disappear into his art, but his art dragged him into the spotlight. Every interview felt like a performance he didn't rehearse for. Every headline flattened him into a stereotype: the tortured genius, the junkie poet, the broken icon. None of those labels felt accurate to him, yet he carried them anyway. Physically, Kurt's body was betraying him. The stomach pain he suffered from wasn't just uncomfortable, it was consuming. It dictated his days, interrupted his nights, and drained his energy. Doctors offered explanations, but no real solutions. Painkillers became coping mechanisms. Coping mechanisms became habits. Habits became dependencies. This wasn't about recklessness. It was about survival. When pain is constant, relief becomes a priority, not a luxury. And when relief is temporary, the cycle never ends. Emotionally, Kurt lived in contradiction. He cared deeply about people, about fairness, about sincerity. He was sensitive in a world that rewarded numbness. He absorbed criticism like truth and praise like suspicion. When fans worshipped him, he felt guilty. When critics attacked him, he felt exposed. There was no safe ground. Even love felt complicated. His relationship with Courtney Love was intense, passionate, and chaotic. They understood each other in ways no one else could, but that understanding didn't always translate into peace. It translated into fire. In March of 1994, Rome changed everything. Kurt collapsed and was hospitalized after an overdose. Official explanations tried to soften the moment, but those close to him knew better. Something had shifted. This wasn't a cry for attention. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was a breaking point. Kurt survived, but survival doesn't always mean recovery. Sometimes it just means continuation. When he left the hospital, he carried the same pain, the same confusion, and now an added layer of fear. Fear that he was losing control. Fear that the people he loved were watching him fade. After Rome, interventions were attempted. Conversations became more serious. The word rehab entered the room. Kurt resisted, not because he didn't need help, but because he didn't trust systems. He didn't trust institutions. He didn't trust being managed. When he eventually agreed to treatment, it felt forced, fragile. And when he left early, it wasn't defiance. It was panic. The walls felt too close. The loss of autonomy felt unbearable. Kurt didn't want to be cured. He wanted to be understood. Back in Seattle, the pattern returned. Isolation, silence, withdrawal. But this time, something felt heavier. Friends noticed it. Courtney noticed it. Calls went unanswered. Messages piled up. Yet no one broke the boundary. Kurt had always needed space. Respecting that space felt like care. In hindsight, it looks like distance. At the time, it felt like kindness. That's how these stories happen. Not through cruelty, but through misjudged compassion. Inside the house, time moved differently. Days blurred together. Night arrived without ceremony. Kurt sat alone with his thoughts, thoughts that had nowhere to go. He wasn't writing letters to the world. He wasn't staging an ending. He was thinking. Thinking is dangerous when there's no interruption. The mind begins to echo itself. Doubts become facts. Fear becomes logic. Exhaustion makes decisions feel simpler than they are. People often imagine final moments as dramatic, but reality is quieter. There was no audience, no soundtrack, just stillness. Objects in the room didn't carry meaning until later. A couch was just a couch. A table was just a table. Nothing screamed symbolism in the moment. Meaning was assigned after the fact, when people needed explanations. That's how history works. We arrange the past to make the present bearable. April 5th passed unnoticed by the world. No alerts, no headlines, just another date. Kurt Cobain didn't vanish in a flash. He faded into silence. And silence is deceptive. Silence can look like peace. It can look like rest. It can look like privacy. In reality, it can be absence. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, time had already made its decision. When Kurt was found days later, the shock wasn't just that he was gone. It was how long he had been gone without anyone knowing. That realization hit harder than any headline. The world reacted instantly. News spread, tributes poured in, fans cried, artists mourned, and almost immediately the narrative solidified. The story was told, categorized, archived, suicide, tragic, inevitable. But inevitability is a comforting lie. It makes loss easier to accept. It suggests that nothing could have changed. Yet questions lingered, not accusations, but uncertainties. Timelines felt strange. Details didn't align perfectly. The note raised interpretations. Some heard a farewell to life. Others heard exhaustion with fame. None of it felt clean. None of it felt resolved. And maybe that's because real lives don't end neatly. They end mid-sentence. Kurt Cobain's life ended while it was still unfolding. What people often miss is that Kurt didn't hate life. He hated distortion. He hated being misunderstood. He hated watching something pure turn into a product. He loved music. He loved his daughter. He loved moments of quiet connection. The idea that he wanted everything to end simplifies a far more complex reality. Wanting relief is not the same as wanting oblivion. Years passed, but the questions never disappeared. Fans kept listening. Stories were re-examined. Documentaries were made. Books were written. Not because people wanted scandal, but because the silence felt incomplete. Kurt Cobain became a permanent what if. What if the pressure had eased? What if the pain had been treated properly? What if someone had knocked sooner? These questions don't change the past, but they shape how we understand it. There's a danger in romanticizing tragedy. Kurt Cobain didn't become meaningful because he died. He was meaningful because he lived honestly. His music mattered because it refused to lie. Turning his death into myth erases the lesson. The lesson isn't about despair. It's about attention, about listening when silence grows, about recognizing that brilliance doesn't protect against pain. The world often celebrates strength, but avoids vulnerability. Kurt embodied vulnerability in a culture that punished it. That contradiction never stopped hurting him, and when the noise finally stopped, people rushed in to explain it. But explanations don't heal absence, they just make it quieter. Kurt Cobain wasn't supposed to die that night, not because he was famous, not because he was talented, but because his story wasn't finished. It didn't reach a conclusion. It was interrupted. And maybe that's why it still echoes. Because somewhere between the noise and the silence, there was a man who needed understanding more than interpretation. Decades later, his voice still plays through speakers, still reaches people who feel unseen. That's not legacy. That's presence. And maybe the most honest way to remember Kurt Cobain isn't to argue about how he died, but to remember how hard he tried to live inside a world that never slowed down enough to meet him where he was.